course, the convener of the Stop the War Coalition, Lindsey.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy, and thanks to everybody who's here today. I think it's a tremendous achievement, what we've done over the last more than 11 years, and I suppose the high point for all of us was the demonstration 10 years ago. I was looking through some of my old files in my computer, and I came across What to Do If War Breaks Out, which was a leaflet we wrote at the time. And we said, occupy the centre of your city, town or village, demonstrate, sit down, make your protest felt, stop the city to stop the war, give an hour to stop the war, strike, walk out of work if you can, if not, call meetings at work to get your message across. If you're a school student, organise walkouts on the day. Everyone can do something. It kind of goes down even to lighting a candle in your window, which actually, I think probably less people did, but actually went out and sat down on roads and went out on strike. But we had millions of people came out on the streets, not just on one demonstration, but time and time again, campaigned and organised in order to stop that war. And that was a fantastic movement. I mean, one of the things that probably makes me most angry when you have the 10 years on analysis from the media and from the politicians is the idea that somehow we supported dictatorship then and we support it now. This was a movement for hope. It was a movement for democracy. It was a movement that spoke for the vast majority of people in this country. And it was the politicians who denied that democracy. It was the politicians who forced us to go to war against the wishes of probably the majority of every single one of their constituents, and we are still living with the consequences. Because the consequences were terrible for the people in Iraq, and this has been spelt out very, very well by the previous speakers, but they've been terrible for us here as well. But when a country occupies other countries, when its government can always find money for war and for weapons, but can't find money for its hospitals and schools and its welfare and looking after the poor. They scapegoat people because they try and turn us against each other on the grounds of nationality or race or religion or whether we're employed or unemployed and all the other things that they do. We should remember what that movement stood for and what, in my opinion, it still stands for. It stands for unity, it stands for opposition, not just to wars, but to inequality, to the attacks on civil liberties, which have been such a major part of the last 10 years. 162 payments by the British Ministry of Defence for compensation for torture of prisoners in Iraq alone, and those are the ones they've owned up to so far. The rendition of people across continents which have led to torture and death and destruction. All of these things, we were absolutely right in everything that we said 10 years ago, and we remain right, and these people remain the same craven, warmongering liars that they were then. And democratic deficit, it's still continuing. We got rid of Tony Blair eventually, although he went off to become the envoy for peace in the Middle East. A worse kind of job description. I don't know whether they looked at his CV or what he was doing, but how unsuitable a job for him. But we now have David Cameron, the man who is now in kind of mission creep on speed, has now gone from 2 planes to help the French in their intervention in Mali to now 300 troops, and where will this continue? Where they threaten to attack and intervene in Syria and Iran, where they back Israel to the hilt, and where David Cameron has told us that we are going to have decades of war in North and West Africa. Now, they never mentioned North and West Africa 10 years ago. This was all about the Middle East, and 11 years ago it was all about Afghanistan, and this was where the danger was. Suddenly, you find that Al-Qaeda isn't just in Pakistan and Afghanistan, it's suddenly everywhere. It's suddenly in Africa, it's suddenly across the Middle East, it's around all these things. Now, my conclusion from that is that a war on terror started 11 years ago to eradicate terrorism and to make British people safe, which is still what they say on the government website as a justification for this war. Don't you think it must be the most abject failure if instead of getting rid of terrorism, it has created terrorism in far more countries around the world? This is after another isolated war. These things are connected. The whole imperial project, which has been reborn with the War on Terror 11 years ago and which has been continued ever since, is something which is part and parcel of a militarised system which is failing economically, which is in great crisis, and which turns therefore more and more to military solutions when it can't deal with particular rulers. Therefore, these wars are all about regime change. They're all about resources. They're all about strategic control. If you look around the question of Mali, uranium, oil, gas in this part of North and West Africa, major suppliers to the French. Does anybody believe there is no connection between the existence of these natural resources and the need to intervene in these countries? Everybody knows, just as everybody knows in the Middle East, there would be no interest in the politics of the Middle East if it wasn't the centre of the resource of oil. All of these things are absolutely fundamental to us. But what today is about is not just about what we did 10 years ago, important though it was, important though it wasn't, important that we can bring crowds of people together in this hall, both to say that we were right, but more importantly, we're not going to accept any more interventions, we're not going to have any of these things going on. What did we achieve? Well, I think we achieved two very, very important things. I think firstly, we did make it much, much harder for governments to go to war. I notice that David Cameron always says, this isn't going to be like Iraq, you know, which does tell you that they're not really very happy with the consequences of the war in Iraq. Secondly, we created an anti-war consciousness, which was so important, which means every time in Lebanon, in Libya, in Syria, in Iran, in Mali, there are people in this country who say we do not believe the government, we do not believe the media, we are going to campaign against it. And that, my final point is this, we have to organise. It's not just enough for us to say that we're against these wars and we think they're terrible. We have to continue organising. We have to do it internationally. This afternoon we've got a number of distinguished speakers from across the world who are going to speak to us today. We have to organise it internationally, but we also have to organise it in Britain. The same government which is bringing us austerity, which is telling us that we have to pay for their crisis, finds endless money for wars, and that cannot be right. It cannot be right that the British Empire, which ended decades ago, is now coming back with their old colonial powers, the British and the French, intervening again in Africa. These things cannot be right. Therefore, it's about getting out in the streets, getting into our trade union branches, getting into the communities and saying enough is enough. We are still campaigning to withdraw the troops from Afghanistan, but we also want to stop any future wars. Thank you.